So today we're going to do a demo of Azure Active Directory Certificate-based Authentication, but coming at it from the angle of how we're seeing a lot of our customers approach it with currently accomplishing Certificate-based Authentication through a Federation service. My name is Keith Brewer. I'm a product manager with Identity and Network Access team, and I've been heavily related in working with the Certificate-based Authentication service. With me today, I have one of our identity-focused cloud solution architects, Mike.
Hey folks, Mike Pearl here. As Keith mentioned, I'm a cloud solutions architect. I cover quite a few federal and civilian accounts.
Awesome. So let's go ahead and kind of jump right into it, right? So typically the scenario, or at least a lot of the conversations I've been having with customers, especially U.S. federal agencies, is around, hey, I'm in my planning cycle for the next 12, 18 months. I'd like to accomplish a number of things related to the executive order. Specifically, the OMB mandate has a number of things directly related to identity, specifically around centralizing my identity provider, enabling phish-resistant multi-factor authentication, and incorporating device signal right into your authentication flows. And so a lot of folks are looking at the phish-resistant MFA piece. A lot of the federal agencies, DoD and such, are pretty good here from the sense that they're already doing phish-resistant based authentication through CBA. The trouble ends up being is that they're almost always accomplishing that through a federated IDP, right? And so in part of that other piece of the OMB mandate around consolidating your identity provider to a single identity provider, there's this move now with our announcement with Azure Active Directory CBA last October to go ahead and move that authentication flow from the Federation service over to Azure Active Directory CBA. Along with that, right, a lot of places in the wake of recent cyber incidents, specifically SolarGate comes to mind. A lot of CISOs are looking for opportunities to kind of have some synergy with those OMB mandates, and moving that authentication flow to the cloud can remove one of the biggest areas that those compromised target in the owning and operation of your own federated IDP. And then lastly, a lot of folks are really coming at it from a consolidation effort, a cost savings effort. If Azure Active Directory can accomplish the certificate-based authentication for PIV and CAC authentication, I may not have a need anymore to run a federated IDP instance at all. Anything you want to add there, Mike?
No, again, if you folks are having these conversations with customers, just remember that cybersecurity is really the big focus here. Getting them to Azure AD with certificate-based authentication, as Keith mentioned, it's going to remove one of those big lateral movement paths from on-prem to the cloud.
Awesome. All right, so typically, I'll go kind of bounce around here in the portal with some of the accounts that we're going to work with today, right? So specifically, if I come in here and take a look at, we're in the Entra portal here for Azure Active Directory, and I have a user here that has been synced from on-prem. And just a couple of things to kind of call out here when we look at the user. A very common pattern that we see with federal agencies, with the Department of Defense, right, is where certificates are issued with, let's just call it a domain suffix that is not able to be verified within your Azure AD tenant. This is usually either because that suffix is not some DNS suffix that you own and can manipulate and can verify in your template, or it's non-routable, right? And so it's just not able to be verified at all. And so if we take a look at this user, this is a user who is in that kind of typical pattern. We hear that referred to as alt ID. That's kind of alternate ID was kind of how we talk about how you set up and configure ADFS on-prem and Azure AD Connect to kind of manipulate the UPN value so that when a certificate is issued in on-prem world where the Active Directory UPN is that non-routable or non-verifiable value, it matches the user's certificate, right? And so we bring that up into Azure AD up here as a property that we call on-premise user principal name. And so you can see here for this specific user, he follows that pattern, right? Where you can see that this value is not a verified domain in my tenant, not able to be. I don't have any access, right, in my test tenant or in the real world, right, to verify Fed ID. And we can actually look at that here as we scroll through settings in domain names. You can see the domain names that are verified, and the one that we'll be kind of playing with and manipulating today, right, is brewerhome.net. Very usefully analogous for your examples, whatever your verified domain that your users are contained in within your environments. It's a verified domain in my tenant, and it is currently federated. Anything else there, Mike?
No, I think that just about covers it.
Cool. So this is exactly kind of where our customers, our federal agents kind of show up for. And so if we kind of look at, well, what does that look like today for certificate-based authentication through a federated instance, right? So I can go access really any resource that triggers authentication within the cloud, right? I type in my user, right? And so some of you all are probably familiar with this here. What's happening here essentially is the suffix here is being vetted against the Azure AD configuration. What we just looked at in Portal, it says, hey, brewerhome.net is a federated domain. Send everybody right to the STS, right? The federated IDP. We obviously, most of our users type in their UPN here, but actually everything kind of heads over, right? Sure enough, the big key here is take a look at the URL change. And you can see, obviously, the look and feel here. We can make Azure AD kind of look like ADFS. You can make ADFS look very similar to Azure AD, right? And so our users don't necessarily notice this change, but you can see here in the URL, we went over to an STS. It's ADFS in this case, and I'm sitting at the page to log in. I click on the certificate. You can see this is the specific certificate that I have issued that maps that same kind of non-routable name. If we go look at the cert itself, you can see this kind of matches the federal ID pattern. If I look at the subject alternative name, it has a principal name for that non-verifiable name as well. Click OK on that, right? Come through, and you can see I've come back through to Azure AD. Azure AD has then issued a token over to the resource that I was headed to. And sure enough, right, I've just done phish-resistant certificate-based authentication via a federated server, right? ADFS in this case to the Azure AD and the end resource. And so this is what our typical world looks like today. We'll close that out and kind of talk about now what needs to happen to kind of move that over, right? And so a number of years back, we introduced a feature called staged rollout, right? And so this isn't specific to certificate-based authentication. A lot of folks use this feature for other authentication methods as well. So if I scroll into here to hybrid management, Azure AD Connect, scroll down here a little bit, you'll see enable staged rollout for managed users. And sure enough, you can see here, right, we have a number of authentication methods that you may want to migrate or pilot from a federation service over to Azure AD. Commonly, historically, we think of this as password hashing. ADFS was doing validating passwords against Active Directory, authenticating the user to Azure Active Directory. Pass through, right, where we go through the pass-through agents and do that. Seamless sign-on as well, but you see here we have certificate-based authentication as well. And I can come in here and I have groups that I can add to this staged rollout policy. And what this is basically doing is let me kind of granularly carve up that federated domain. So now when a user types in whatever at brewerhome.net in this case, I can go, the domain's federated, but some users should stay here in the cloud. And so if we come back through and take a look at groups, I have set up a group here for staged rollout. And you can see our user, right, is a member of that group. Now, obviously, that group is not in staged rollout yet, and that's why we were sent to the Federation service. So let's just go ahead and do that. Right here in Azure AD Connect, enable staged rollout, manage groups, add our group, go find our group, and select. And so now that that's been added, right, this full disclosure, this process can take a few minutes, right? As we add this group, the members of that group kind of get iterated through, and then they are added to this policy that allows Azure AD to then go ahead and know that, oh, this is a user that should stay here in the cloud. While we're kind of
Oh yeah, go ahead, Mike. Things I wanted to point out about this particular process right here. The first you'll notice at the top, when you add a group, the group size cannot exceed 200 users. You can add a group of exactly 200 users, and then you can feed more users into the group once it's added to this configuration. You just can't add a group that exceeds 200 users. The other thing to note is that when you add users to stage rollout, there is no expectation that the users will be prompted for authentication for whatever stage rollout mechanism you enabled. And that is because the user is still a valid user. They still have valid tokens. So there's no expectation of them being prompted just because you've enabled that particular user for stage rollout. When their tokens naturally expire and they do need to re-authenticate for whatever reason, then this process will actually kick in.
Yep, good call out. All right, so let's go take a quick look at the configuration just to familiarize what's set up here in my tenant. Different folks can have different settings. Previous sessions, we've kind of gone through this quite a bit as well, right? So you can see here for my authentication method, certificate-based authentication settings underneath. It's calling out in my tenant, right? It's turned on for all users, right? And then within configure, couple of things that you'll see here is that, my protection level is set to single factor authentication. What this basically means, right, is that all certificates, when they show up to Azure AD's front door, are considered single factor. And then I've added rules where I expect that to deviate, where I want a certificate that maybe to meet multi-factor authentication requirements. And in my case, right, a specific issuers, right, where you see here with these two issuers would meet multi-factor. Or if a certificate shows up and presents with this OID, you can also consider that to be multi-factor authentication away. You'll see here also in the point down here at the bottom, Bamala probably later in this session, we start talking about roadmap items, has a number of improvements that we're doing here throughout this page and throughout these behaviors. And then worth calling out here at the bottom, this username binding area. I can pick parts of the certificate apart to map to user accounts, and I have to basically say what part of the cert maps to which attribute of the user so that I can know how to match the certificate authoritatively to the user. In this case, right, that principal name value of the certificate within the subject alternative name maps to my user's on-premises user principal name. So that's that little piece that we looked at earlier, where the Active Directory on-prem UPN was that non-verifiable domain. That is being brought up into Azure AD as the on-premises user principal name, and then I'm using that attribute in Azure AD to map the user. We have another attribute available as well in the certificate user IDs. This is where we store any number of other mapping methods. And so we probably should call out here that while not directly related to Azure Active Directory's implementation, I know a lot of the people listening and going through this demo, right, have been a part of the changes on premise, right, with Active Directory recently introducing the strong versus weak mappings through the alt-sec ID patterns, right? Today in Azure Active Directory, we have some of those mapping methods. So the subject key identifier mapping mechanism, then the SHA-1 public key. And again, Vimal will have some updates here later this later in this presentation to kind of go over what's coming to bring the rest of those methods as well. Anything there, Mike?
No, I think that just about covers it.
All right, so here's a little trick, right? So we can go kind of try to get a little bit of assurance here that this process is kind of kicked off. And we can see here, if I come into the audit logs, we will actually add an audit log entry, right, when that group gets processed, and we can kind of have a good feel that users have been added to the staged rollout policy. And so we can see here, add user to my specific user that we were talking about to that modified property, right? So CBA user 1 has been added for certificate-based authentication. So I start to get kind of a good feeling, oh, the next time this user gets prompted for authentication, they should actually stay in the cloud. Let's go see if it worked. So let's go ahead and just open up a new window. We'll go to that same process that we were doing before, right? Same. Type it right. All right, so same story that we were doing before. They type it in. Keep an eye on the URL here. It should happen a little bit faster. We click next, and sure enough, right, you can see I wasn't sent anywhere else. I'm still here in the cloud, right? And this is actually a user behavior that we have here today where you see the user now, because certificate-based authentication has been enabled in my tenant, that they get this prompt where they can sign in with a smart card here, right? So you'll see if I click on here, it'll actually start to prompt me for certificates. It's that same list that we saw when ADFS was asking before. It's probably worth calling out here that both in that previous experience, that user type in, that sign in with a certificate, being surfaced on that password entry screen, Vimala will have a number of updates. We've got a lot of feedback on this flow. And so we have a number of things coming to try to help this process. So sure enough, I pick off that same certificate. I authenticate here. Again, you can see I completely stayed in Azure AD here. I never left. I was never sent off to another federated IDP. This authentication happened with a certificate, phishing resistant, natively, completely in the cloud. Anything else there, Mike?
No, that should cover it.
Awesome. All right, so we'll close that out. So we're getting towards the tail end here now, so it's worth calling out a couple of things around the staged rollout is essentially this last step, right? So now, right, we were doing certificate-based authentication against Federated IDP. We now have a number of users that are doing it natively in the cloud through the staged rollout piece. And that very last piece is, okay, now I want that entire domain, in my case, that brewerhome.net domain, to go from a federated domain to a managed domain. So now all users within that would stay in the cloud, right? And so I'll make that that bit flip here, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some of the nuance here, right? So we have there's a number of articles that kind of go through this, but we can kind of run through and run these commands. It's an admin account. It's probably worth calling out that this is a highly privileged change, right? Changing a domain from federated to managed that requires global admin rights. Now we've authenticated within the PowerShell. We can go take a look at the settings that you see here, right? So you can see that this is a federated domain now, right? Just as we did. So already all the federation data is here. And this is the command, right? So full disclosure here, this is the button that flips the domain, right, from federated to managed. So let's go ahead and kick that off. Right, sure enough, we've run again. And now, right, if I want to kind of check that setting against the graph PowerShell, git -mg domain, and sure enough, you can see, right, it is now a managed domain. Now, again, similar to the staged rollout policy, this can take a few minutes, right? 30 minutes, 45 minutes sometimes at times to take full effect. Your users will not see any of this, like Mike had mentioned earlier, right? They still are valid users in Azure Active Directory. They still have their tokens that they've been doing. This is just that nuance of will they be redirected or not, whether or not they were in stage rollout or not. While we're kind of waiting on that to cook, Mike, you want to talk a little bit about some more about the why it's important to kind of to wrap this up, to finish this step, to do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. The first thing you should understand about stage rollout is while it primarily applies to interactive logons, the user going to the service, accessing something, and being challenged directly by Azure AD, the Federation service and the tokens issued by the Federation service are still valid. If I were to start from ADFS, get a token, and then go to Azure AD, it would accept it even if I was a staged rollout user. Right. So the thing that you want to know about stage rollout is that you don't want to remain in staged rollout forever, because as we mentioned at the very beginning, we're doing this because we want to remove that lateral movement path. We want to be challenged directly by Azure AD and enter into a fully managed authentication model rather than staying in a federated model. While you're in stage rollout, it's also important to note that there are certain flows that will use the federated model even for staged rollout users. Hybrid device flows and things of that nature will go through the Federation service silently, again, mostly non-interactive flows. So once we get to this point where we're ready to actually perform the transition, that's the step that we need to take in order to actually meet those security requirements and ensure that we're a little bit more secure in how we're dealing with this. The other thing to notice about this is all we're really doing by enabling these features is cutting the cord between our Federation service provider, in this particular case, ADFS, and Azure AD or the Microsoft Cloud. We're not breaking the relationship between other applications that customers might have still integrated with their Federation service provider or ADFS, right? That's another effort that the customer can undertake, and doing this will not affect those applications that are still integrated with ADFS.
Yeah, great call. So two things to add there is I think that's probably a great demo to run through in another session is a big cohort of our customers are literally using a Federation instance like ADFS only and simply exclusively to do certificate-based authentication. This is the work to finish the job here for those customers. A lot of folks are in the boat that you just mentioned where they have both certificate-based authentication and apps on those Federation services. And we have a number of features to help you discover those apps, understand how to migrate those apps so that you also can go through both sets of that work and realize the full promise of being able to actually shut down that Federation service. And then the last point, because you mentioned interactive and non-interactive flows, and I'm sure a question could likely come up, but hey, Keith and Mike, like I have workstations and my users log on with certificates to workstations and they get the primary refresh token and they get this nice, pretty seamless sign-on experience through the Federation. Does that work with Azure AD CBA? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, right? And so we did a number of work within Azure AD CBA to make sure that now you can go through this process end to end, and your users who are authenticating with a certificate to Windows devices will using a certificate will result in a primary refresh token getting issued, which lets you bring things like that device signal requirement and those MFA and phishing resistant MFA requirements with new capabilities like authentication strength all to bear, so that you can meet those requirements even when you're signing into to Windows as well. Okay, so this is done, right? So this domain has now been moved over and federated, or I'm sorry, federated, and moved to managed, right? And so if we come back in and take a look at the portal, right, we have another, and now obviously it wouldn't be a good example, right, if I use that exact same user, because that user was in staged rollout, right? And so let's go pick off a user here. All users. And let's go with cloud. And you can see this is a cloud 15 user. He is the same thing. He's a synced user. He happens to have routable information or a verified domain as well, right? So if I click on his on-premise information, right, you can see he comes in here. And I can show you the certificate as well. Actually, when we go to the picker, we'll do that, right? So same thing. Let's go in and open up a new window and go to portal.office.com, cloud 15. And the key here, right, is, make sure we type that right, is I'm sitting in this domain, right? And this is the domain that was federated before, where we would expect any user that got put in here that wasn't in staged rollout would be sent to the Federation service. And if I click in next here, you can see he stayed here in the cloud. And so this kind of gives you that final end promise to your CISO around the security, your final end promise to meeting those requirements for delivering phish-resistant MFA, for consolidating your IDP. At this point now, right, and we can just go ahead and pick off a cert, right, finish the deal. You can see just to show you the cert that was issued, right, same thing, subject alternative name. Right, cloud 15, right, same thing, okay, and then we go all the way through, right? And so this is really the culmination of that. You could now, if you're that customer it's in that bucket where you're like, I was literally just had a Federation service to accomplish certificate-based authentication, all of your users for this domain, right, are now in the cloud. And so if this was your only domain, you could feel pretty good now about going through the work of decommissioning your Federation service and then finally realizing the cost benefit savings of not having to manage that and operationalize that as well. And so with that, that's the demonstration for today. Mike, anything else you want to add here at the end?
No. Again, if you guys are having these conversations with your customers and you do run into some issues or you get stuck or you need help, don't be afraid to reach out to resources that are local to you, CSAs or likewise.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for the time.
Thanks.